Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the briefing room. Yes, indeed, yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, is here with Magnitude Software. Very excited for today's event, Pivot to Success, Achieving Business Agility with Data. Yes, indeed, today's speakers are yours truly and Craig Chaplin, Senior Product Manager at Magnitude Software. And folks, Magnitude are the people who bought Simba. And Simba, as you may know, has a long history in the data management space. They're the folks who invented the Odbc and Jdbc drivers, used kind of by just about everybody in the world. So Magnitude Software and Simba are really at the foundation of the data space itself, which is very exciting stuff. So we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about a case study as well. So I love this meme. It went around a few weeks ago. Who led your digital transformation? A, the CEO, B, the CTO, or C, COVID-19? I think for most organizations, the answer is decidedly C. COVID-19 has been a force function to change everything all around the business world. So one of the aspects of that, one of the side effects, if you will, or the responses to it is this Paycheck Protection Program here in the US, which is an absolutely stunning program. So the whole idea was that the government didn't want the economy to collapse as companies were told to close down, which was widespread, as everybody knows. As a friend of mine pointed out, the government shut down the revenue producing side of the economy, but kept open the debt servicing side of the economy, which is interesting. But the feds stepped in a very bold fashion and throughout this program, the Paycheck Protection Program. And the idea was to loan money at very, very low interest rates and even forgive it if people use the money to pay for employees and utilities and so forth, if they do it properly. But if you think about it, it usually takes months to get a loan. It takes us a long process to get a loan traditionally. Well, that had to be expedited significantly, and the results have been really kind of amazing. 1.6 million PPP loans have been approved, and this is from a couple of weeks ago. And if you look, I have a quote here on the side that says, in the last few months, the US market went from having 15,000 lenders lend in 15,000 different ways to having 5,400 lenders lend in one way. That's Karen Moynihan from a company called Boss Insights. That's a pretty big deal. That's a pretty fast transformation, and it was data driven. So we want to talk about what's going on there. So I took an interview from Karen last week and learned about something that's a new trend. There are a couple companies in this space. In fact, one of my long-standing colleagues in the business, a guy named David Greeno, was working with another company doing something similar to this. But what Boss Insights does is truly fascinating. They have API connectors to 800 plus different corporate systems. So of course, the accounting side with QuickBooks, Xero, Sage, etc. But billing, the billing side, the sales side, CRM, marketing, customer support, operations, even HR systems. If a would-be borrower wants to work with a bank that is using this technology, what they do is connect their systems to this technology, to the APIs, and Boss Insights is able to gather tremendous insights about how well the company is doing, but also about the nature of the company itself. And the idea here is that the bank can then use this insight to find the appropriate program and better determine whether or not to give the loan. I think it's something like 27% typically of companies get approved for these loans, just in general, not the Paycheck Protection Program, but just in general, it's a pretty low number. But think about how it's usually determined whether or not to give that loan. It's really kind of a gut instinct. There are some basic numbers that these companies look for, like 1.25 is a metric used in terms of looking at cash flow and looking at their ability to pay back the loan. But really, it's been a fairly thin connection, if you will, and again, relied heavily on reputation or gut instinct or things of this nature, not data driven. Well, here's what I like the most about what these folks are doing and why it's such a compelling case study for achieving agility, data-driven agility in the face of very serious external circumstances, right? Extenuating circumstances, as they call it. What I find so cool is that the banks will share this information with the borrower. So it's not just that the bank gets this information and can look over it and make a determination. No, the bank and the would-be borrower get this insight, and they can then collaborate and talk to each other and figure out what works. Well, here's how a lot of folks have viewed the lending industry over the years. So a loan shark, their payday loans, things of this nature. That's not a very positive analogy, is it? And a lot of times you go into a bank and you're trying to borrow money, and it feels like this. It feels nerve-wracking. I know I don't have nerves of steel. We don't like to borrow money in our company. We're a small company. But I remember a couple years ago, well, 3-4 years ago, we were looking into getting a line of credit because we're a small company. It would help to have a line of credit. We went to Chase. That's the bank that we work with, and they just were not even interested. It was just not even going to happen. And despite being a good going concern, we've been in business for 7-8 years now. People pay us, knock on wood. Nonetheless, there was a lot of paperwork, and there just was no interest at all in working with us, no pun intended. So, but then one day I looked in QuickBooks and I saw a little advertisement for Fundbox. It says, hey, we see that you've got some invoices out. You can borrow through Fundbox. And I figured I'd try it out. And so I did. And with a few clicks of a mouse, I got a line of credit. Now let's think about that. This is a new company, Fundbox. They are data driven. They've been connected to QuickBooks. So they can see into our QuickBooks environment, and they can see on average, people pay in 36 days or whatever the case may be. On average, this is the deal size. This is how long they've been around. It doesn't take too much math to figure out. You can write an algorithm to determine how good this potential borrower is going to be in terms of paying things back. So this is kind of what the Boss Insights folks do, but at a much larger scale. So with Fundbox, it's just through QuickBooks and they get some third-party data. And this really got me thinking what they're doing and other companies are doing is really like a data-driven bridge to the future. So for those of you who play bridge, you know that it's a game of 4 people and 2 teams. And typically what you have to do is you can't show your cards to each other as your team members, you're across the table. So you go through this bidding process. And in that, you're trying to send hints to your partner of what kind of cards you have. And so that kind of determines your strategy for the game. Well, I also have thought about and written about what's going on with all this third-party data everywhere and being able to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to get signal from data, or what I call real-world data at scale. And now there are companies, institutional investors, for example, big investment banks, I won't name any names, but I know that they have access to tremendous amounts of third-party data. And it's the kind of situation where they know which companies are going to meet or beat earnings estimates based upon real transactional data at scale. Well, that would be like a card game in which they can see all the cards and you can't, right? So they know what to bet on. They know which hand to bet on. And really the only thing to stop a stock market like that would be some sort of massive macroeconomic event like, I don't know, COVID-19. So pre-COVID, the market was going up. It was 29,000, approaching 30,000 pre-COVID. And then, of course, this hit and we wound up with this disastrous scenario. Well, let's think about this. What we're now seeing with this collaboration between banks and borrowers is almost like a game where they can show each other the cards. And then it's the bank and the borrower, not against each other, no, collaborating with each other against the market at large. That is a much more positive environment, it seems to me. It's a much more positive way of looking forward and fostering partnerships between borrowers and lenders that is data driven. So I talk about this all the time. What's the most important aspect in any work environment? Morale. If you feel like you have strong partners working with you, if you are using data to drive your decision making, guess what? Your morale is going to be high. You have confidence. You feel good when your morale is high. Good things happen for your company. Good partnerships fuel that. Data can lead us to good partnerships. So my prediction is that data-driven models will revolutionize modern lending and, of course, modern business across the board. That's just one industry. We're going to hear from Craig Chaplin here of Magnitude in just a moment about what they're seeing out in the marketplace. But when borrowers and lenders really collaborate to share deep insights about critical corporate data, you're going to have much stronger partnerships. It is a classic win-win. This is good stuff. It's happening now. There's a slide about yours truly and enough about me. And with that, let me hand over the keys to Craig Chaplin. I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter, Craig. And we will have a poll, actually. So I'm making you the presenter, and I think that I can push the poll now. So I'm going to launch this poll. Folks, if you would take a second to look at this, and this is for attendees. So what's the most important attribute of the data-driven enterprise? If you would take a moment and just answer that. So is it A, using data, Is it B, connecting fragmented data? Is it C, real-time analytics? Is it D, automating business processes? That's a good question. We've got a few more seconds here. We've got about 30% of people have voted. Yeah, if I look at this, I ask myself this question, what's the most important for me? You know, I'd probably say for our company, it's using data, but as I look at larger organizations, I think one of the most important aspects is automating business processes, quite frankly. But we're watching as the results come in. 59% have voted. Anyone else? Anyone else? 61%. We've got some more folks voting. Anyone else? Going 2/3. We'll call it 2/3 is good for 1 minute of the poll, and we'll close the poll, and we'll share those results. So look at that. Using data, 23%, connecting fragmented data, 30, real-time analytics, 32, and automating business processes, 16%. You know, that's pretty interesting because let's think about this for a second. That's a very even distribution, actually. So it's a good poll question, good, well designed. And I think as time goes by, more and more companies are going to go to number 4, automating business processes, because I think that's going to become a much, much bigger deal over time. I'll hide the results. And Craig, you should be able to share your screen and take it away.
All right, thanks, Eric.
There you go. Looks good.
All right, good. Hi, everyone. So I'm Craig Chaplin. I'm a senior product manager at Magnitude. Previously, I was with Simba, and which was acquired by Magnitude, as Eric mentioned earlier. So good to be with you today. Just a glimpse at Magnitude. You know, for those of you that haven't heard of us or don't know much about us, so Magnitude has a portfolio of products that look at data management, analytics, business optimization, and of course, connectivity as well. We've got about 550 employees worldwide. Simba is one of those family of products that provides connectivity to our enterprise customers, but also a large number of our ISV customers as well. So companies like SAP or Microsoft, Amazon, Google, etc., and many of the BI vendors bundle our connectivity into their solutions. We are global, so we have offices across North America, Europe, and India. And it's Magnitude's made up of several acquisitions over the years to support this portfolio of products. So that's just a quick glimpse at what Magnitude is. So and today, you know, we're going to look at some of the transformative changes that are happening in business. There's an obvious one, of course, that we are all living today. But what are some of the things that have happened over recently that has really driven how we do business, some of the business models we have, and of course, you know, the reliance on the data side of things to be able to facilitate that. Ironically, last year I actually did a webinar with our general manager at Magnitude for the Simba business. We did a joint webinar around sort of digital transformation and you know, really talking about, you know, there was a real opportunity for businesses to take advantage of new technologies and either enhance their existing business models or perhaps introduce new ones. So just some examples that we've seen you know, in the last few years, you know, if you look at sort of the automobile and sort of some of the things that have happened in that space, you know, the taxi industry, of course, is an obvious example here that's been upended. Their sort of model has really been hit by, you know, the introduction of companies like Uber and Lyft that are providing ride sharing. You know, and even the notion of having to own a car in some places, you know, is something that can be questioned right now that we have the ability to, you know, through car sharing companies. And if we think about, you know, how did that all come about from the technology side of things, it was a big part of that is that sort of ubiquitous mobile connectivity that we have now. So everywhere we go, it's really hard not to stay connected to the internet, right? And of course, you know, we have very powerful smartphones now. When you think about it, that we're carrying around with us everywhere. Subscription services, you know, is another area. You know, this idea of just paying for things as you go rather than, you know, owning something. So, you know, if you look at music collections, you know, previously it would be a shelf full of records, cassettes, CDs, choose your generation. But now, it's which streaming services do you subscribe to? Same thing with movies, right? And video. So previously, Netflix would ship you out DVDs through the postal service. Now, of course, we can do all that online. And again, that's the type of thing that's been enabled through technology advances with broadband, right? So not only have we increased the speeds so that we can do things like video on demand, but the prevalence of broadband connectivity has also increased. So more and more users have access to this. And of course, that makes that model of video on demand, for example, possible. Another interesting one is sort of the service side of things where there are some companies now that are deploying sort of machinery, whether it's farm machinery, factory machines that have instrumentation on board that phone home and provide updates as to when maintenance is required on different components. And this means that that farmers or factories can really reduce the downtime for their critical machinery, so they can get things fixed only when they need them fixed, rather than taking them out of production. And again, that's similar to kind of what I was saying earlier with the automobile industry, is that that fact that even in the middle of a farming field, we have the ability to connect to the internet through satellite. Even Elon Musk, for example, has been busy lately throwing those into orbit to provide broadband like speeds from satellite, which a few years ago that would have been unheard of. So there's certainly technologies that can transform businesses, and you could argue that sometimes businesses influence what technologies could get developed, and so it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. But sometimes business transformation happens because of world events. So it could be global conflicts. So one that's maybe a little bit back in history nowadays, but back in the 70s, of course, we had an oil embargo where OPEC shut down oil to North America, and that really caused a bit of a crisis in terms of not only people being able to fuel up their vehicles, but having to fuel up vehicles that were large, weren't particularly fuel efficient, and it caused real problems. Oops. And so, this really kind of forced, people started to look at smaller cars, more fuel efficient cars, and that was from the Asian markets, from Japan. And so the domestic automakers really had to pivot and start to really change the types of vehicles that they were making at that time to provide what people were looking for. Along the ways, of course, they implemented things, improvements in fuel efficiency. Global warming, I think, is obviously something that is impacting us, more and more, whether it's through severe weather events. It's could be impacting tourism. We see some of the changes in this area too. So we see new technology to harness renewable energy. But in other areas too, it's interesting, because if you start to look at some of the hedge fund portfolios, you'll see that hedge fund managers are starting to purchase up farmland and water rights in parts of the world that maybe aren't, currently, the best farmland, but in a few years, as the temperature warms up, it becomes much more profitable. So they're buying up sort of rights, hedging that our environment's going to change. And of course, the increasing regulation to try and slow down this is not only creating new technologies, but forcing businesses to add that into their business models. In my backyard, more or less, so I live in Vancouver, Canada here. So you may have heard of Whistler Blackcomb, which is our somewhat famous ski hill, but we have some local mountains as well. And the one that's just outside of Vancouver here is at a lower elevation. And it used to be that the amount of snow and the length of time that the snow would be around for skiing on was quite a bit longer than it is today. And so over the last sort of 10 years or so, they've had to really pivot and change kind of how their business works. And so in the summertime now, they've done a lot of investment into promoting tourism during the summer, events and that sort of thing. And so much so that the amount of revenue that they pull in during the summer is almost as much now as what they do in the winter. So as far as what has sort of things like the pandemic and COVID kind of really changed here? Well, I think where many of us are now working from home, so we've seen a rise in technologies to help support that and sort of evolve. And businesses are trying to figure out how do they support their staff and be able to do that. We see some changes in logistics. So I'm sure many of us have gotten those brown boxes on our porch. So vital that we're able to be able to order online and have those delivered. I was just reading recently, actually, that Amazon, they just finished one of their quarters, and they announced that they're looking at spending $4 billion on COVID-related expenses. Which, to put it in perspective, is almost equivalent to their entire profit for next quarter. So not only have they impacted that much, but it's that important to them to put in place the ability to provide goods and services during this time. And restaurants as well, are relying on services like Uber Eats, for example, to provide takeout. So restaurants that have had to shutter have rather than completely shut down, have tried to pivot and figure out how can we still provide food to customers, how can we still get revenue by leveraging some of these other services, these food delivery services. Grocery stores, likewise, I mean, we certainly had online grocery ordering for a little while, but that's become much more important, and some of the smaller grocers are starting to put their goods online and allow you to come and pick them up, or in some cases provide delivery as well. From the service sector, we've seen some interesting increases in telemedicine. So, the ability to deliver sort of healthcare through a video conference versus having someone to come into the doctor's office or worse, have to go into hospital. Being able to provide that healthcare through video services is crucial, and especially when you start to look at some of the more rural areas that don't have as much access to healthcare as we might do in the larger cities. Education, so like many of you, I'm sure, my son, that had to start schooling from home. So there's a rise in academic platforms for delivering courses. So institutions can now put their courses online through these platforms and do home learning. And PayPal, for example, is certainly not new to this space, but as more and more businesses provide that digital storefront, they need payment services as well. So we start to see some changes in products and services that cater to those smaller businesses as well. So what's interesting is that, even though whether it's something that's technology driven that's causing us to rethink how we do business or modify how we do business, or if it's global events that a lot of times are out of our control and we have to adapt to, some of the key concepts are still important regardless. And really it starts with customer experience. So it's an often used term, but really it's the difference between someone staying with you and going to a competitor. So really important to still maintain that. Collaboration, that network effect that we have with our businesses is crucial. And as we found, that process agility, so being able to really adapt quickly. So if your supply chain is disrupted because of a pandemic, for example, how quickly can you adjust things? We also see a lot of, especially with data in particular and data access, we see a lot more need for, supporting the regulations and compliance new privacy laws that are coming into place. So businesses are a lot more, are paying a lot more attention to those areas as well. As far as the technology side of things, I think these are probably pretty obvious ones, right? I mean, social media still remains a crucial way of communicating and communicating with your customers. Analytics and AI is really kind of a space that's really started to heat up in the last 10 years or so. And this is because we actually have more data to work with. I'll talk about that in a minute. IoT, so Internet of Things, is one of those things that's feeding that additional data. It's what's enabling us to really sort of, provide that instrumentation on different devices and smart devices. Cloud and mobile, we talked about earlier, that mobile experience, being able to, everyone has a mobile phone. They're quite powerful now. So being able to deliver, your business services and your products through a mobile interface. And of course, cloud, I think a lot's been said about that, but just, the ability to leverage the cloud as a way of hopefully offsetting some of the costs of delivering products and services. So, when it comes to data, businesses today kind of live or die based on their ability to access and integrate data. And really because without data, there's no information. And without information, we can't do effective decision making. I talked a little bit about AI a second ago, and really that machine learning and AI tools are really starting to come into their own now that we have these large data sets that they can learn from. The insights that we can glean from those using those tools is much greater. So, why is sort of that access to data, really important? Well, if we look at sort of, the number of data sources that companies are using or their employees are using to make decisions, it's growing. It's always growing. So today we're looking at, in a typical decision-making scenario, more than 50% of people are looking at 5 or more sources of data to make that decision. If we pick on marketers for a second, we'll see, even in 3 years from 2017, they might be looking at 10 different sources to track customers. In 2019, that's all the way up to 16 now. So where's this data coming from? Well, lots of different places. We talked a little bit about some of these, but social media, there's a vast amount of data there. Unfortunately, sometimes too vast for some people, but there's certainly a lot of data there on social media that is very useful for companies to be able to leverage. Smart devices, the Internet of Things. So this is feeding back information that's useful to understand how people are using your products. Trends, perhaps, help you forecast, where people are going with your products. Media, so when we think about the amount of video content now that's online, you look at YouTube, for example. It's more than just cat videos, right? There's a tremendous amount of data that can be understood by understanding people's viewing habits, the types of topics, the content that they're looking at. Biometric data, so ever more important as we start to really pick apart at a molecular level sometimes what makes us tick, and certainly important in current circumstances where we're trying to understand the COVID virus, for example. Geospatial, so it's great to have data. Even better is if you know where that data was generated. And then, transactional, it's still around. It's still crucial to running our back office applications, and it's kind of the core. It's the record of us interacting with our customers through businesses. So we have, we kind of have this infinite cycle that that we need to be able to manage effectively. We have a tremendous number of applications that are already being used within our organizations. that's not going to be less. It's going to continue to grow. We have to deal with applications and data that's now deployed in multiple places. So it may be on premise, it may be in the cloud. And if it's on the cloud, it may be in multiple locations on the cloud, right? It might not just be in Amazon, it might be in Azure, for example. And then, if we look at kind of, the importance of data within an organization, it's only increasing. So currently, almost 70% of companies feel that data is their most important asset at the moment. So really, what has this meant for data connectivity? And sort of these are the trends that we've seen here at Simba over the past few years. The obvious one, of course, is that there's more applications and more workflows that are capturing data and larger amounts of data. We have a lot of different types of data stores to hold that data. It's no longer just your relational Oracle DB2 SQL Server database that's storing all this information. We also have a lot of new applications and a lot of different types of applications to analyze that data. As the data takes shape in different formats, whether it's geospatial data, whether it's graph database, if you're trying to understand the relationship of entities, we have different applications that take advantage of that. I mentioned earlier, we have sort of more regulation around data, so data governance is becoming more and more important as companies need to adhere to privacy laws. And probably more, most important is that more users need access to that data. It's no longer just the data analyst, it's no longer just the data scientist perhaps, but it could be people on the shop floor, right, that need to be able to plug into that data. And ultimately, how do we, with all these new data sources and these new users needing access to those data sources, how do we facilitate getting them that access? How do we reduce that friction? So one thing that we've done at Simba is we have a set of connectors to a lot of different types of data sources. So whether they are your traditional relational sources like Oracle, for example, they could be some of the big data sources like HBase. They could be NoSQL sources such as Couchbase. But they could also be cloud data sources as well. So applications like Salesforce, for example, have a vast amount of data that's useful for people to be able to access to. And so we have a lot of these different connectors, and one of the things that's really important is to have a standard way of interfacing with those, because we can't have a unique interface for every data source for every application that needs to use that. So fortunately, there is a standard out there. There's actually a couple different standards, of course. There's never one standard. So Odbc and Jdbc is a common one for data access, and the majority of applications that consume data support these interfaces. And Odbc is actually one of the technologies and standards that Simba worked with Microsoft back in the 90s on developing. So this is something that's been around for a long time. It's evolved since those early days, but it's still, even today, serves a crucial need in providing that general purpose data access to these data sources. It does that through SQL, and which is still a very popular language. It's still used predominantly for querying data. So Simba has a lot of expertise in building these drivers, so much so that we actually get contracted and work with some of the data source vendors to provide that connectivity for their customers. So we'll work with them to best understand how their source works, how best to query it, and then build the corresponding Odbc and Jdbc drivers to do that. So we do have a bit of a paradox of choice though. So we live in a world where there's no shortage of data and there's no shortage of tools to analyze and use that data, which sounds fantastic. So if we look at a single use case, if you took Excel, for example, and we want to connect to a set of different data sources, that's great. So you can come to Simba and we'll be happy to provide you with drivers for connecting to each of those data sources. So that sets you up for Excel. But then what happens when you start to deploy that elsewhere in the company? So what happens when that user says, well, I use Excel for some things, but I have a BI tool for generating some of the analysis that I need to do. So now that tool needs to be able to connect to all those data sources. And now you need to actually provide that to all of your users in your company. Oh, and by the way, these data sources, they're not static, of course. They change over time. So Salesforce may add some new capabilities that generate some new data and some new objects that need to be captured. So now you need to keep the Salesforce driver updated. So this poses a bit of a challenge. And really we need to figure out a way, in larger enterprises, how do we help out IT? Because we ultimately know that IT is going to have to figure this out and is going to be responsible for deploying a connectivity capability. How do we help out IT and really sort of free up some of their very finite resources? How do we make it easy for them to manage all of that? So one of the newer products that Simba's developed recently is something we call Magnitude Gateway, which does that. So if you have a large number of users and you have a large number of applications and you have a large number of data sources, Magnitude Gateway is a product that can take away a lot of the friction, a lot of the maintenance hassle of maintaining all of that connectivity. So what we do is we provide a single driver, whether it's Odbc or Jdbc, that all of those applications can use, whether it's Excel or Tableau or Power BI or any of the general purpose tools that can use Odbc or Jdbc. We provide one driver and it connects to Magnitude Gateway that's installed on a single server. And on that server is all your connectivity to your data sources. So what that means from an IT perspective is that you're really just managing connectivity on one machine. So as new capabilities are pushed out by us, you can deploy those onto that one machine, and all of your users have access to that now. The other interesting thing for IT, of course, also is data connectivity can be quite technical sometimes. Getting it set up, figuring out which server do I connect to, what's the Salesforce URL that I need to use to be able to connect to Salesforce? Are there any performance options I should be using? Should there be any options that I should set to convert data? Perhaps I want to deal with date time formats differently, for example. So these are all sort of options that are available, but they might be a little bit overwhelming to the end users. So from a Magnitude Gateway perspective, we allow IT to actually deploy those profiles once. So users don't have to worry about setting those up. At most, maybe they have to enter their user ID and password to connect to a data source. So really, Magnitude Gateway is about kind of lowering those maintenance costs, that maintenance burden, really trying to streamline the management of all your data connectivity. If a new data source is needed by a group of users, simply add it in one place and they have access to it right away. The centralized governance is crucial for IT. So trying to reduce their workload, being able to manage all of that in one place. And really, the other thing I didn't highlight too much here, but we also, with some of the data access, it's one thing to be able to connect to data. And once you have access to a data source, that's great. But a lot of data sources will then present you with tens of thousands of tables to choose from. And so really trying to find within a data source, where's the information that you're looking for can be a bit of a challenge. So one of the things we've done for some of our sources is what we call intelligent adapters, which is really trying to put a business view on top of those sources. So Salesforce, for example, we would present a business-like view of data that to the end user just looks like a single entity, a single table, for example. But behind the scenes, there may be 4 or 5 or more different joins between multiple tables in Salesforce. And all that complexity is hidden from the user. So it's a way of really helping people get ultimately to the data that they need as quickly as possible. So in sort of summary, access to data is really foundational to all of this. We can't adapt our businesses quickly unless we know what's currently going on, and wherever possible, try and really kind of predict where we're going to be going. And having access to data really allows those things to happen. How do we do that? Well, from a data connectivity standpoint, it's really about providing that standards-based data access, so multiple applications can leverage that access to data. We need to be able to get to data, irrespective of its structure. So if your data is stored in a relational format, great. But if you've actually got unstructured data as well that you're pulling in from a NoSQL source, we need to be able to handle that in Excel just as easily as we do with relational data. And so a lot of what the important thing here is to be able to coerce that data structure into a format that can be queried in a common way across multiple applications. It doesn't necessarily take away the need for very purpose-built applications to analyze spatial data, for example, but there's a lot of cases where you don't need a fancy tool to get to your spatial data. You just want to pull it into an Excel worksheet, for example. Accessing data where it resides is important. So, we've kind of gone from, accessing the data in place to let's put everything into a data warehouse. Let's put everything without worrying about too much how it's structured into a data lake. Let's try and speed things up by putting data in memory, maybe structuring it a little bit different, and of course the cloud. So what I wanted to say here is that data doesn't exist in just one place. And in many cases, it's not feasible to move the data all into one place. So we need to be able to access that data wherever it is. If you can put it all in a data warehouse, fantastic. We can access that data warehouse. If you need to keep it in 3 different places, that's okay too. We have connectivity to those different places. And finally, to really kind of reduce that maintenance, so we know that the number of sources is going up. We know that the number of users that need access to that data is increasing. So a data connectivity platform like Magnitude Gateway, for example, might be the right option to kind of streamline some of that maintenance and connectivity needs. So, really trying to reduce the burden on IT and let them manage actually keeping getting the data to where it needs to go rather than actually having to manage all the connectivity to it as well. So with that, I think we're going to open up to some questions, Eric.
Yeah, and a lot of great points in there. If you would push one of your architectural slides out there so the audience has something to chew on while we talk about all this stuff. Maybe that last one that you just had, I like that one. The one right after that, yeah. That's good.
This one, yeah.
So you made a bunch of really good points. One is helping IT, right? Because we are in this really interesting transformation right now where it used to be you had to rely on IT to give you the connectors, to give you the data that you wanted, but we need to move a layer above that, if you will, to enable IT to focus on different things, right? And you made a good point about how there are so many different sources of data right now, especially software as a service. We're talking 7,000 different applications are now being used by companies for sales and marketing automation. That's just the MarTech 7,000. That's not even accounting, billing, forecasting, all these other technologies that we need to use. So Gateway gives you this ability to really optimize what IT is doing, but at the same time, you're also facilitating data governance, right?
Yeah, I mean, a big piece of data governance is knowing what data are people accessing, right? And so, having that centralized in one location lets us do that. But also equally important is being able to govern who can access that data and really being able to restrict, where appropriate, access to the data as well.
Yeah, so one of the attendees writes, to what extent is data governance necessary as a predicate to leveraging data towards success? I think it's a central component. And to your point, there are technologies available for data governance, but the real key is that you need to have some sort of control point. That's what we refer to in the risk management space. I started off talking about financial services. In the risk space, they talk a lot about control points, and that's the point at which you can effect some change. It's the point at which you can capture information, you can make a decision, you can say yes or no, for example. And what you're doing with Gateway is basically providing this marshaling area for data access, which again, just in terms of simplifying IT's job, allows the IT person to get something deployed once and then have anyone else who is logged in and authorized to the system access that. You're no longer having to cater to person A, person B, person C separately. You cater to the information system that they access, and as such, you're tremendously streamlining what was a fairly cumbersome and not very fun process. Isn't that about right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in when we were at a time where we had few data sources to worry about, things resided in your on-premise data center. You had few users using this. I think the role of IT was a lot easier, and I'm sure some folks in IT say, "Oh, that was the good old days, right?" But
Right.
yeah, I think now that we have more users, more types of users, more applications, and of course more data sources, then yeah, IT's job has grown exponentially and more expensive as well.
So that's a really interesting comment from an attendee who says basically he sees more users doing what we used to have to ask programmers to do. Do you? And this is kind of talking about self-service, right? So it used to be you'd have to go to a programmer to write an ETL script to get the data, for example. That is an effective means for getting data, but it doesn't scale. That's one of the astute observations from an analyst, Rick Sherman, I learned years and years ago, in fact, on DM radio. He said, yeah, those custom written scripts are fine for the purpose that they were designed to achieve. But as time goes by and data volumes grow, for example, they're going to break. They're going to be very brittle, and you're going to need a programmer to come in and do that. And what we're really talking about to enable much broader use of data is to come up with some mechanism, some process for facilitating that such that you don't need to hire a programmer. I think that's a pretty significant trend in the marketplace, and it's basically requisite if you're going to move into a more of a self-service environment. What do you think?
Yeah, no, it's huge, and I'm dating myself a little bit here, but my first summer job was my first real summer job anyway, was working in programming RPG to build reports on a green screen. So, when I look at the tools today that we can use, whether it's even Excel, for example, or Power BI or any of the BI tools today, they are so intuitive. They are so feature rich and powerful compared to even 20 years ago. It's amazing what you can do with them, and of course that's really empowered more and more users to be able to use them, which is fantastic, right? We want more people in business being able to make really informed decisions using these tools, but that also means the tools and what they're connecting to becomes that much more mission critical. And anything that's mission critical, we know IT gets involved, right? And so that's really kind of crucial to figure out, how do we make sure IT, who are still the gatekeepers to technology in the business, and they should be, right? How do we make sure though that they get to focus on the right things that and not get bogged down with some of the data connectivity aspects.
Okay, that's a really, really good point. I'm reading lots of questions here from the audience, so let me just triage these real quick. So one of these attendees is asking, okay, regarding connecting to or importing external data sources, how do we appraise its value for decision making? Is there a rating of external sources to indicate the level of trust? That's a very interesting question. So I think that that's a combination of consultative processing, really talking to consultants or to just your team to understand. But inside Magnitude, is there any sort of collaborative component, or is there any way for the team to give votes of confidence for this source or for that source, anything along those lines? What can you say about collaboration and about user feedback?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And in a previous life, I actually worked for a BI company, several actually. And so that was always a struggle, right? And it was, yeah, it's great we've got access to data, but is it the right data? And
Hmm.
or you might go to a board meeting and three different people bring three different sets of information to answer the same question, and come up with different answers sometimes. So um, yeah, as far as Gateway itself, I think at the moment the way it can help with some of that trustworthiness is really providing um, a trusted set of sources that people should be pulling data from. So for example, if you have a data warehouse in your company or several data warehouses, perhaps, being able to say, okay, here's the one for our corporate financials, set up a connection profile that's where that points to. So to make sure that people are getting, the actual, live real-time data versus perhaps a sandbox environment that someone might have set up. So that's at a really low level, I think, just making sure people are connecting to the right source. Um, if we take that a step further though, if we start to understand what data people are connecting to, what sources, we can start to say, okay, well, the majority of people use this source versus that source. And we can start to really say, okay, here's where the majority of people are connecting to. Chances are that is more likely to be a valuable source than one that one or two people are connecting to. It's
Hmm.
not the complete answer, of course. But taking it up another level higher than that, that's where we start to get into things like a data glossary and a business catalog, where you start to map out your data that you have in your organization to say, okay, this is where customer orders resides. In a customer order, this is what a particular field might mean, or a particular property of that order might mean. And so you really start to define your data a bit more. So some of Magnitude's products, we have a product called Noetics, for example, that is very powerful for accessing Oracle eBusiness Suite data. And it has a concept of that business catalog and glossary where it maps out the data in Oracle EBS, explains what it's used for, and then that's available to you when you're querying it with Excel or Tableau or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And so basically what you're saying is just by virtue of using Gateway as the cornerstone, if you will, of your information sharing stack, that's going to be the centralized area for truly trusted data. And it can graduate data's information systems really over time into that environment. And again, folks, the value proposition here is multifold. It is number one, having a centralized area to manage. This is going to be crucial over time as data sources proliferate, and that is absolutely going to happen. You're going to see more and more data sources coming around, not just transactional data, but all sorts of as they call it, third-party data, right? So I kind of referenced this real-world data at scale at the top of the hour here. And as you get more and more of those systems coming online, you're going to need to have some sort of marshaling area to manage all of that. So that's part of it. But governance, again, is a big part of the equation. And over time, as regulations change, as market forces change, you're going to need to really have your head around what's going on the governance side. So that's going to facilitate quality, it's going to facilitate access, it's going to streamline the processes. So there are multiple reasons why this approach is useful and effective. And I got another really good question here from an attendee saying, today we see several data lake platforms to manage and process all these data sets with specialized engines. And you kind of have that on your slide here. I see Hive down at the bottom. There's another example of how quickly this industry changes, right? We had a whole burst of Hadoop activity years ago, and that has now subsided somewhat as the cloud has taken over as a new center of gravity, if you will. But regardless of which direction you go or which systems that you're using, nonetheless, the value proposition of Gateway remains the same, right, Craig? It's a marshaling area for trusted data that is used for critical business processes, right, Craig?
Yeah, and if you do have a data lake deployed and behind the scenes it's pulling data from multiple sources, that's fine too. We can access the data lake as if it's a source in itself. and so there's still that connectivity all the way through, to be able to do that.
Okay, good. We got some other questions too. So one of the attendees is asking, it sounds like it's great for a large organization. What about for a small business? How big a company do you need to be? How many systems do you need to have for the value proposition to make sense, the sort of net cost benefit? Is there some sweet spot? Obviously, the large organization is going to need this kind of thing. Small to mid-sized businesses, I'm guessing just because of that MarTech 7000 factor alone, it makes sense for small companies too. But what do you think, Craig?
Yeah, we actually have a version of Gateway called Gateway Desktop, which is as the name implies, is for more of a workstation type deployment, or a departmental deployment. And some of the features in there that are useful for a smaller number of users is having that catalog of sources available. So you may initially maybe only need it to connect to Salesforce. That's fine. But let's say you've used it for 6 months and then you decide, okay, I need to now pull in my Marketo data as well. Within the product, you can download the Marketo adapter. You don't need to really worry about how to install it. The product takes care of that itself. And then the actual user interface for it, we've really tried to, as much as possible, I think I mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but we've really tried to simplify the user interface for configuring connectivity. Anyone that's poked around trying to configure an Odbc data source today knows that most of the time it was written by developers for developers, and it's not for someone that's stuck in Excel and is just trying to get to their Salesforce data. So one of the things for gateways that was very important to us was that customer experience, and so we have tried to improve the user interface and get rid of some of that really technical jargon that's there.
Well, usability, usability is key. And if more people are going to access data and use data, that user interface is really critical. And I think that increasingly, as we spread the use of data and generate more value from data, that's going to be one critical success factor, is how usable is the technology, right? Because DBAs are still in short supply. It's a very fast moving market. It's a very specialized market these days. So the simpler you can make the interface for managing connectivity, the better off people are going to be, right?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And that it's all about removing that friction wherever we can, whether it's IT itself, or all the way to the end user, right? We don't want the connecting to data to be the hard part, right? It's hard enough, when you're looking at the data to try and do that decision making and figure out, what it is you're analyzing. But if we can at least streamline that connectivity, then at least that's part of the problem solved.
All right, we're getting deluged with questions, which is always a good sign here. We only have a couple minutes left, but folks, I will be sure to pass all these questions on to Craig and his team at Magnitude. But a very interesting comment from one attendee who's talking about data virtualization, which went through an early revolution, probably 15 to 5 years ago or so, and now is coming back in some various forms. This is not quite like data virtualization. It's an interesting question, though. But to me, what's interesting about the gateway approach is that you're taking this centralized hub now and offering it as the marshaling area for connectivity. So it's a place to go for the business to connect to any number of data sources, and it becomes that sort of beating heart of data movement and data access, which again provides governance. It streamlines the process. So I wouldn't really liken it to data virtualization, but more like an optimized traditional hub and spoke architecture for provisioning access to any number of information systems for any number of business users. How would you respond to that, Craig?
Yeah, I mean, if we want to invent a term here, I mean, it's maybe data connectivity virtualization, that we're kind of virtualizing that connection for the end user, at least, to say, here are a set of connection profiles that are things like, your sales orders, your inventory, and really we're trying to hide from the user what is the backend source of data for that. So they don't know and probably don't need to care about what is the underlying technology that's storing that data. So we kind of virtualize that connection in that regard. But we're certainly not trying to virtualize data itself. I mean, I think there's plenty of solutions to choose from to do that. We're not trying to build another data warehouse or data lake technology here. We're really focused on the connectivity piece at this point.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. Well, folks, we burned through an hour here. Big thanks to our friends from Magnitude Software. Big thanks to all of you for these fantastic questions. We even have more streaming in right now. I'm going to be sure to get all of these over to the team at Magnitude. But thanks for your time and attention, folks. I'm really excited about this. I think that Magnitude has done an excellent job of, as Craig suggested here, virtualizing the connectivity side, which for those who have not done it, I can tell you it is a very painstaking process. It's very detail oriented, and to abstract that complexity away and just provide this hub where business people and IT folks can collaborate, that's a big, big deal. We'll catch up to you next time, folks. Thanks again, Craig, and thanks to the folks at Magnitude and all these great attendees and your wonderful questions. We'll talk to you next time, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.